the exciting thing from my point of view about mutual interest is that we look at a program and we see how we can make it work for each other, rather than, you know what, guys, we are building a road for you, then we're leaving it there. But I think as we engage, as we say, well, okay, if that's what is happening, how do we make sure that we have the knowledge transfer? How do we make sure that we have the technical capability? How do we bring our own private sector on board so that this is not done unto Botswana, but it is done with Botswana?
Good morning, my name is Amandine Sabourin. I work with ECDPM, the European Centre for Development Policy Management, and we will talk today about the definition of mutual interests between the EU and its partner countries. As you know, there has been a lot of changes in the EU development policy recently. For once, we wanted to change a little bit the perspective and look at these changes from some other lenses, especially wanted to look at the implications of these changes for partner countries. For this discussion today, we wanted to look at the relationship between the EU and Botswana, because on paper, a lot of interests are common between Botswana and the European Union. So that's why I'm joined today. I have the honor to be joined today by Madam Ambassador of Botswana.
Thank you so much. My name is Mmasekgoa Masire-Mwamba, Botswana's ambassador to the Kingdom of Belgium and the permanent representative to the European Commission. And it's a great pleasure for me to join you in this session, as we have just recently signed the new agreement, the Samoa Agreement. And it is very important as we look forward to rolling out the Samoa Agreement that we look at how we redefine the concept of partnerships, particularly from the point of view of developing countries, but in the context of partnerships with the EU. So I'm very happy to be here, and I thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Madam Ambassador. The Samoa Agreement indeed is the agreement that sets the priorities of the partnership between the African, Caribbean and Pacific countries and the European Union, and has been signed recently to follow the Cotonou Agreement to renew the partnership after the Cotonou framework.
Yes, indeed. It's a representation of the evolution of the relationship that the EU has with the Africa, Caribbean and Pacific states. And it is an opportunity also to restart that relationship and to relook at the areas of focus, the areas of priority, and to look at the modalities of how we operate. So this concept of mutual partnership and mutual interest is very timely, and it fits very well within this context.
Good, thank you. And how concretely are the priorities or the interests, mutual interests, defined between the EU and Botswana?
For Botswana, it has actually been an evolution. Our relationship with the EU is a long-standing partnership, a long-standing relationship. And what happened as we evolve into this phase of the partnership is there has been extensive consultation with Botswana to identify the areas, the priority areas for the country. The country has an ambition to become an upper middle income country, and in that ambition, it's important to look at issues of economic development, issues of social development, and issues of international cooperation and collaboration. So it really fits very well into the Botswana's broader agenda, and the consultations that have taken place in anticipation of this have been there to support us in that respect.
When we talk about the interests, one of the characteristic of the definition of the interests that are put forward is that they are supposed to be mutually beneficial. Could you elaborate a bit on Botswana's views, maybe, and interpretations of whether this is actually possible to have mutually beneficial interests?
I think it is possible to have mutually beneficial relationships and mutually beneficial interests. the challenge comes in how we define the interests. I think up to now, the sense that we have had, particularly from developing countries, is that the interests have been imposed on as opposed to being coming in from the developing countries themselves. And so if we move into a mutual partnership stance, then we are asking both sides of the table to highlight the interest from their point of view. And it's also worth acknowledging that sometimes the interests will differ because the priorities are different. A lot of the time, the reason the interests differ is not that we don't want the same thing. I think all countries want the best for their people and want the best for their own sovereignty and their own development. However, the priorities will differ from time to time, depending on the imperatives that are on the ground. So for Botswana, for example, job creation is one of the key areas and the key matters of interest that we're looking at. And job creation in the context of a partnership is looking at opportunities for foreign direct investment, looking at technology transfer, looking at setting up value addition and value add in the economy. So it's really looking at where are the areas of need, how can we work on them together, and what can be the impact of that to the people. And likewise, beyond poverty reduction is also the notion of, job creation is also the notion of poverty reduction. And so when we meet with the EU and we say, what's top of mind and what are the areas that you would like to work on, that's what we would want to consider. And what we find in engaging with the EU is the focus on regional integration, the focus on gateways and infrastructure development sits very well. So we are addressing the same issue, but focusing or addressing it from two different points of view. And so to the extent that we can make the partnership have an end product that works for us, then we say, well, if the EU's focus at the moment is not necessarily to come and set up a factory, but it is to create the enabling environment that then opens up for private sector in that regard, then that becomes an area of mutual interest.
So in that sense, concretely, this new way of defining the mutual interest and also maybe the tools, the NDICI, the Neighborhood Development International Cooperation Instrument that finances the EU cooperation, and also the Global Gateway Strategy as a policy framework are actually allowing to work better at country level and making links with the regional ones.
For a country like Botswana, which is a landlocked country, linking to the external environment is extremely important. So linkages in terms of the road infrastructure, rail infrastructure is very important because, first of all, it gives us access to the markets around us. But also in the broader context of Africa's development, we now have the AfCFTA, which is there to open up the avenues for trade, for intra-Africa trade. And therefore, that is how we derive the linkage. So if EU in this new agreement says, okay, we want to work on the gateway because we want to work with the regional neighborhood and so on and so forth, it works well for us. And I think the exciting thing from my point of view about mutual interest is that we look at a program and we see how we can make it work for each other, rather than, you know what, guys, we are building a road for you, then we're leaving it there. But I think as we engage, as we say, well, okay, if that's what is happening, how do we make sure that we have the knowledge transfer? How do we make sure that we have the technical capability? How do we bring our own private sector on board so that this is not done unto Botswana, but it is done with Botswana? And that's really where we believe the change is in this new environment of defining and agreeing upon mutual benefit, mutual interest.
When we met in March at a roundtable discussion with the on similar topics. You raised the issues of ethics and asymmetry of the partnerships. Could you elaborate a little bit on that and maybe explain what kind of unintended or unforeseen consequences might be in the case of the EU-Botswana relationship?
In terms of the unintended consequences, I think if we roll back a little bit, how do we get to unintended consequences? And we get to unintended consequences when we don't have clear guidelines and communication about what it is that we want to do, and when policies are not developed with the end user in mind. So one of the key challenges for developing countries is the notion of social justice. And so when we talk about ethics in our engagement, we would like to embark on projects and initiatives that have a healthy dose of social justice, because we also, in terms of poverty eradication, in terms of inequalities in the society, that becomes important. So let me give you an example, a couple of examples. We have activity that is centered around diamonds and the EU ban on diamonds. And the unintended consequences is that, yes, we can comply with what the EU would like us to do. However, if it doesn't take into account the local diamond industry, it doesn't take into account the national opportunities for beneficiation and value addition at source. It doesn't take into account other imperatives that contribute to the social justice. The second one, another EU policy on the ban of the hunting ban, is that Botswana is very keen to look at the wildlife-human conflict and address it in a manner that also engages the communities and brings the community interests on board. So it does become a challenge if the policy is pronounced upon and the engagement supersedes the policy, because now we are addressing communities, and communities are like, where is our input? How is that taken into account? We've seen some other developments in agriculture, similar types of issues. So the ethical component is just the element of transparency, the element of, yes, this is what we would like to achieve. And the question I like to ask is, I know what we want to achieve. How else do we do that? And I think in a partnership, asking that question is absolutely crucial, because if I'm looking at it from my point of view, sitting in Botswana, I will find, okay, this is an issue. I know the EU is also interested. This is how I think we can sort it out. But because I'm only looking at it from my point of view, it may not be a way that also works for the partner. So in a partnership, it is so important that we share our thinking in an open, transparent manner. And the ethical component also is that it's in a manner that doesn't put the country, the developing country, on the back foot. So we have to make sure that, for example, if we're looking at raw materials, yes, we can agree on raw materials and working with partner countries on raw materials, but to what extent are we depriving the local communities? To what extent is the mining done in a manner that is sustainable? To what extent? So those are some of the questions that we need to engage on. And really, partnership is exciting because it's an opportunity to sit together and to tease out different options and different opportunities. But I find where a partnership is challenged is when the discussion is after the fact.
That would lead to a partnership of equals. So having this new kind of way of definition of the mutual interests would lead to a partnership of equals. So we are on the good way, you think?
It really would. It really would, because you see, the word equals in a partnership is an interesting concept, because the relationship will always be asymmetric. what the EU brings to the party is very different from what the developing country brings to the party. And so if we look at it in concrete terms, it might look like, oh, this is a partnership that is more in favor of one and not the other. But on the other hand, if we look at it as there is value will always be there for both parties. So the EU will not engage with developing countries unless there's value. So the challenge becomes, how do we articulate that value? How do we speak to that value? How do we publicize and make sure that the asymmetry that might be there when you look at the issue from afar is actually not an asymmetry, because it is acknowledged that the value is there, and how do we quantify and project that value?
Maybe a last question on looking at the EU from the African perspective, if you allow me. So in light of the changing landscape in the political environment, also in Europe, we wanted to ask you about the priorities of the EU that might be evolving. In that context, what would be your expectations from the future new leadership of the European Union?
The new leadership of the European Union has a great opportunity to re-engage with developing countries, to re-engage with a country like Botswana. And I would really focus on the social justice. I think this is an area that we have not spoken about before. We speak a lot about human rights. Human rights speak to me the individual and the individuals and the rights that are attributed to the individual. And I think that social justice is a much broader concept, and a concept that can make for meaningful engagement. That is the kind of situation which allows the people to understand on both sides. And I think a new government, public education, public engagement around what we are doing, why we are doing it. And that's why I was very pleased to be on this show, to start to talk about what is it that we are trying to define in our new relationship, and how we are trying to challenge each other to really articulate our value add in both quarters. I think in the past, a lot of development assistance has been quantified in euros or in US dollars or whatever the currency of the day is, but very rarely has the value addition that the country provides. Right now, we have an interesting conversation around critical raw materials, for example. Critical raw materials may be sourced in one part of the world, and they may contribute to industry and contribute to development in another part of the world. But if only what lands on the table is the amount that is paid for the raw material, it belies the fact that there was a value addition. And so for me, the two great things is, let's articulate the value addition that each of us brings to the table, and let's ensure social justice so that we address the public good. We go beyond human rights, which are important and integral, and we all signed up to the Human Rights Declaration. So holding each other accountable in that respect is a good thing. However, let's not stop there. Let's look at the seriousness, the transparency, the value add, the technology transfer, the empowerment of the private sector, and the development. And I said it before that, one of the lessons learned out of COVID, for example, was just how ill prepared we were as society, because we found that the solutions to the challenge were in one part of the world and we're lacking in another part of the world. And so what is it that we are going to do differently? So that's my challenge to the new EU leadership, to say, what is it that we're going to do differently to ensure that we create the opportunities on both sides of the spectrum? Because we need each other. We need to work together, and we need to collaborate and coordinate our engagement.
Thank you very much, Madam Ambassador, for this discussion, and for reminding everyone that these partnerships, it's all about a two-way street at the end, and we need to listen to each other more carefully, maybe. Thank you very much, and have a good day.
Thank you very much.